The Senate Intelligence Committee held a public hearing Wednesday to discuss the dangers facing the U.S. from around the globe. This week, the government released its annual assessment of worldwide threats. The report broke down the intelligence community's biggest concerns related to geopolitical competition, domestic extremism, and the impact of the pandemic on humanitarian and economic crises. At Wednesday's hearing, the Director of National Intelligence said China and Russia present the most serious risk of undermining the U.S. But when it comes to terrorism, Director Avril Haines said the most pressing danger comes from home.
With regard to global terrorism, ISIS and al-Qaeda remain the most pressing threats to U.S. interests overseas, as was noted. These groups seek to conduct attacks inside the United States, but sustained counterterrorism pressure has broadly degraded their capabilities. Domestically, lone actors and small cells with a broad range of ideological motivations pose a greater immediate threat. We see this threat manifest itself in individuals who are inspired by al-Qaeda and ISIS, often called homegrown violent extremism, and those who commit terrorist acts for ideological goals stemming from other influences, such as racial bias and anti-governmental sentiment, which we refer to as domestic violent extremism, or
For more on this, let's bring in CBS News intelligence and national security reporter Olivia Gazis. Hi there, Olivia. So Director Haines said that U.S. counterterrorism efforts have suppressed the global terror threat. How might the drawdown in Afghanistan impact that?
Well, Elaine, it was striking that just hours before President Biden announced that he intended to draw down U.S. forces in Afghanistan by September 11, his own CIA director, William Burns, said bluntly at this hearing that following that drawdown, the government's ability to collect on and to act on threats will diminish. That's simply a fact, he said. And he acknowledged that there is a significant risk of a resurgence in terrorist activity. But he caveated that with two important qualifications. One, he said that the threat from ISIS and al-Qaeda, as the DNI clip that you showed also said, after years of counterterrorism pressure, was diminished to the point that neither one of those groups can any longer carry out a threat on the homeland. They want to regain that capacity, and they're working towards it, but aren't currently able to do so. That's a meaningful assessment from the leader of an agency that has spent almost 2 decades squarely focused on this very issue. Burns also said that even after withdrawal, the CIA was going to retain a, quote, suite of capabilities, some existing, some new, that are going to help the U.S. anticipate and contest any rebuilding effort by extremists. So in sum, it's hard to say whether or how significant a resurgence we can expect to see. The director himself said that there are too many variables to know that at this stage. But what the intelligence community is saying is the threat is diminished to the point that it can't reach us here right now. We'll have a diminished capacity to monitor it, but we will monitor it. And if it becomes necessary, we're going to help the U.S. or its partners take action, again, if it becomes necessary.
Well, on Tuesday, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin announced the U.S. will send 500 more troops to Germany, just as Russian forces are building along its shared border with Ukraine. How is U.S. intelligence approaching Russia's actions?
So this is an intriguing and a repeated question that you've heard asked by lawmakers and by journalists alike, is what are Putin's intentions here? Is it military action? Is it a stunt? Is it to distract from domestic trials at home? There's no doubt that the intelligence community has an assessment on this issue as to what his intentions are, but the director was clearly not willing to go there in an unclassified setting today. What he did say was that the buildup was of great concern, of course, and that he had learned over the course of his career, which includes some years spent as the ambassador to Russia, never to underestimate the ability of Vladimir Putin and of the Russian leadership to throw its weight around. So what he said this could be is signaling on Putin's part, trying to intimidate Ukrainian leadership or to send a message to the new U.S. administration that he's not to be trifled with. Most strikingly, both he and the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Lieutenant General Scott Barrier, said that the Russians have already laid some groundwork that would permit them to engage in a limited military incursion or an objective strike. That's something that Burns said President Biden expressed serious concerns about on the phone with President Putin yesterday.
Interesting. Well, following the recent SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange cyber intrusions, what kind of picture is the intel community painting about cyber threats?
This got a lot of attention today, and it's coming from a committee that's pretty savvy on these topics. They're steeped in it, having had hearings on social media, on election interference, and more recently on the fallout from the solar winds intrusion attributed to Russia. What they heard from the NSA director, General Paul Nakasone, today was more about the reasons why he's limited in what he can see domestically. So the NSA's ambit is overseas surveillance, figuring out what other adversaries are saying and preparing to do. And there are U.S. laws and policies in place that prevent them from looking inward. He was very clear. He did not want expanded authorities for either the NSA or Cyber Command, which he also leads. The NSA learned a pretty tough lesson a few years ago about domestic surveillance, so he does not want those authorities. But he said that adversaries know what those limitations are, and so they're increasingly structuring their attacks to exploit those legal and policy boundaries. They know exactly how long it takes the FBI to get and act on a warrant. So they're sort of tailoring their attacks to fit within that window and disappear within that time frame. They're also, he said, faster, broader, more sophisticated. They're not using simple tactics like spear phishing or guessing passwords. They're using supply chain vulnerabilities. They're using exploits. These are higher tier activities that he said had made the U.S. stand up and take notice. This is definitely going to be a massive and ongoing challenge, not only for the intelligence community, but for the U.S. government writ large.
It's alarming to hear that, but it's so important that people are kept aware of the nature of these kinds of threats. Olivia Gazis for us. Olivia, always good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elaine.